Last week we saw how God caused the armies of Assyria to sweep down from the north and wipe the nation of Israel from the map of history. And so our last two studies will concentrate on the last kings of Judah. King Ahaz was on the throne of Judah when Israel was destroyed, and we don't have time to talk about him today. We're going to concentrate on his three successors, Hezekiah, Manasseh, and Josiah. Father, son, and grandson. It's one of the mysteries how the grandfather and the grandson both turned out godly and good, and the son in between turned out wicked. Maybe some psychologist can explain that to us. I can't. Hezekiah came to the throne and was immediately faced with the greatest crisis Judah had ever faced. It was rather reminiscent of Abraham Lincoln when he moved into the White House on the 4th of March, 1961. 5 weeks later, the guns of Charleston opened fire on Fort Sumter, and the Civil War began. What a way to begin your presidency. Well, it was similar for Hezekiah. The trouble had been brewing for some years away in the east, 1,200 kilometers away. Assyria had been growing into a world power, and they had been spreading across the whole of the Fertile Crescent, crushing underfoot everyone they came across, every city, every town, every god crushed under their feet. And then they came to the gates of Palestine. The problem for Israel and Judah was they stood in the way of Assyria to the greatest prize of all, Egypt, and so they had to go. Well, we've already seen how they swept down and wiped Israel from the map of history, and now they stood at the gates of Jerusalem, literally at the gates of Jerusalem. It would make a great movie scene. The armies of Sennacherib lined up outside, the great gates closed, and the huge walls with people all over them looking down at the Assyrians. And then an emissary arrives with a letter, and to the annoyance of the Hebrew officers, he reads it at the top of his voice so that all the people can hear what the king of Syria has to say to Hezekiah. It's a letter full of scorn and mockery and threat, listing the gods that have already fallen to them and saying, how can you expect your God to save you? The letter's handed over, Hezekiah receives it, and then he does a wonderful thing, something that has been copied by believers ever since, when they're faced with something they can't solve. He takes it to the house of God and lays it before the Lord. I have this picture of him kneeling on the marble in front of the altar, putting the letter down and then taking his hands away. I can do no more. I'm in the hands of God. There are times we get to that point. Every alcoholic knows that they cannot solve their own problems. And so every day they pray the prayer, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Hezekiah has not been passive. He's done what he can. In fact, in preparation for the coming siege, he performed one of the great engineering feats of the ancient world. He dug a tunnel right underneath the hillside through solid rock to divert the water from the Gihon spring inside the city, so at least they wouldn't die of thirst during the siege. And so he created the famous pool of Bethesda. Wendy and I walked through that tunnel. It was very exciting. It's like walking 2,600 years back into history. You can still see the marks of the chisels as if they finished last week. In the first half, they go from right to left. The second half, they go from left to right because they were digging from both sides. And miraculously, they met in the middle. Hezekiah had done what he could, but now he could do no more. So he takes his hands off. There was a Boeing 707 that was forced to do a wheels-up landing in Nairobi airport. The story that led up to that is very interesting and exciting, and we were lucky enough as young people to hear it told firsthand by the navigator on that aeroplane. But the end of the story, he describes how they came down through the low cloud with only one opportunity to land, and there in front of them were the lights of the runway, slightly offline. And he watched from behind the pilot as he took what felt like an eternity to get the plane how he wanted it. And then he pulled back on the throttles and took his hands and feet off the controls and left the plane in the hands of God. And not a single person was killed. And that's what Hezekiah does. And God honors him and gives them a great deliverance. It's a great story. I'll leave you to read it for yourself. And so Hezekiah has a good reign, a long reign. Then he falls desperately ill, and he pleads with God and the prophet Isaiah to give him some more years, and his request is granted, and he lives another 16 years. But it's not entirely sure if it was a good idea or not, because during those 16 years he made some very serious mistakes for which Judah was to pay dearly in the future. We never know actually what's good and bad for us. The story is told of an old Chinese farmer who had one son and one horse. And then the horse disappeared, and his neighbors came in to commiserate with his bad news, and he said, "Good news, bad news, who knows?" A few days later, the horse came back, and 2 beautiful wild horses with him. And so the neighbors came in to commend him on his good news, and he said, "Good news, bad news, who knows?" A few days later, his son was trying to tame one of the horses, and he fell off and broke his legs. And the neighbors came in to commiserate. Good news, bad news. A few days after that, the soldiers of the emperor's army came in and took all the able-bodied boys away to war. And because of his son's broken leg, he was left behind. We can very seldom tell if something is good news or bad news. And there are times just to accept what God decides to do. Well, Hezekiah dies, and his son Manasseh takes over. Manasseh holds 2 records in the kings of Judah. He was the longest ruling, and by far the most wicked. We are told that he filled Jerusalem from end to end with innocent blood. He introduced an absolute plague of idolatry of the worst kind. He even instituted a male prostitute cult in the temple, would you believe? Worst of all, he erected a massive iron statue to the god Moloch, with his ferocious head and a hole in his belly where they built fierce fires. And Manasseh threw his own son into the fire. Can such an evil man ever be saved? Well, the answer is they can. Eventually he repented and he came back to God, and he was restored. A similar story was told by John Newton, who was a slave trader and then came to Christ and wrote, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me, even a wretch like Manasseh." But the damage was done, and he died. And his son Josiah took over at the age of 8. By the age of 15, he began to realize what had been going on, and he gave orders for Judah to be cleansed of the evil. And there's a whole chapter given to how thorough he was, getting rid of it all, and especially cleansing the temple. And while the temple was being cleansed, the high priest found a scroll, and he brought it to Josiah and said, "We don't know what this is." It was the Torah, it was the books of Moses, for goodness sake. Not knowing what it is would be like a pastor saying, "What is this thing called the Bible?" And so Josiah said, "Read it to me." And as they read, he began to weep. And I must say, personally, I long for the day when Christians in large numbers start to weep for how far we've come from the law of Christ. I'm horrified at what the church is countenancing these days. And as they read, they discover it's time for the Passover, which they haven't observed for many, many years. And Josiah commands it to be observed. And they do. It's one of the great redemptive moments in the history of the Old Testament. Last week we looked at the spiritual history of some of the kings of Judah. We saw David, who started well, had a dreadful drop in the middle, but was largely restored. We saw Joash, Amaziah, and Uzziah, one after the other, start well and finish really badly. Very sad. Today we've seen Manasseh, who started incredibly badly and yet, by amazing grace, was restored. And then we've seen Hezekiah, who basically led a good and godly life, just a bit of a dip towards the end after his illness, but nothing salvation threatening. But just look at the graph of Josiah, good and godly from beginning to end. The only other person I know in the Old Testament like that is Joseph. And then, of course, there's one in the New Testament, but you don't need me to tell you his name. So what is the value of us 2,000 years later looking at the lives of these ancient kings? Well, when you see a king like Josiah, it's like studying the life of Lincoln, which I've done at considerable length, or of Nelson Mandela, men committed to goodness. Hebrews chapter 11 is similar, that long list of saints who've run the race, who finished the course, who kept the faith. The purpose of looking at them is that we might be inspired to be righteous, that we might be encouraged to know we can do it, that we can want to be holy. And you know, we're told that all of those saints are looking down now and watching us run the race to see how we're going to do, and hoping that we will finish well, and that our names can be added to Hebrews chapter 11, which is the only chapter of the Bible that is still being written. It would be wonderful to be a good example to those who follow me. Wonderful to have an example to follow. I have a friend called Maureen. When she was only 13 years old, she went to see the movie Ben-Hur. And when it came to the point where Esther went down into the valley of the lepers every day to bring them food, as Maureen watched that, she knew then and there, I want to be a nurse. And she became one. And she's been a wonderful, compassionate nurse since then. It's wonderful to have an example that makes you want to be righteous.